The Trump administration announced Friday that it is pulling more than half of its staff out of the American embassy in Havana. This comes after diplomats and staff suffered mysterious health attacks that caused minor brain injuries.
This was a terrorist attack against U.S. diplomats and their families in Cuba.
I think this is an act of war on our personnel, and we have to figure out who did this.
Diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Cuba had been tense for decades, extremely tense. The Cold War never really ended there.
The government in Cuba, I think it's still a threat to the United States.
So many years of hostility, of strained relationships.
But in 2015, the political winds started to shift. The Obama administration re-established diplomatic ties with the Castro regime. For the Americans, life in Havana was truly idyllic. They'd fall asleep to the chirping of cicadas, an ever-present feature of life in the Caribbean. And they'd wake to the sound of rooster crows.
I mean, Cuba was fantastic until it wasn't.
Embassy life isn't always romantic. A lot of it is pretty standard office work. There's civil servants, there's consular officers, but there were spies too. There was a CIA station within the embassy. The FBI, responsible for counterintelligence, had a desk there too. And all these people come and go.
When people started, disappearing, it wasn't really noticeable at first. I remember asking somebody that was working in the consular section, I was like, hey, what happened to this person? And they're like, oh yeah, they've left, they got medevaced, I'm not sure if they're coming back. I was like, wow, what?
Karen works on an upper floor of the embassy.
As she turned a corner, she heard this very high-pitched noise.
The sound is piercing.
It's like a tea kettle, which is like on steroids. That high-pitched whistle that was so intense that she jumped back around the corner.
That evening, she starts having symptoms.
She started seeing some black spots in her vision. By the next day, it was growing. The ophthalmologist is like, well, your retina is definitely bleeding. I've only ever seen this when somebody has a trauma to their head, like a car accident or something.
She gets flown to Miami, where a team is evaluating a rising number of similar cases.
She'd lose her balance and she'd start to fall. She was not able to remember things.
The skeleton staff that remain at the embassy are tense, paranoid, jumping at every sound. By this point, cases in Havana number around 24. Like Karen, they report things like nausea, dizziness, vertigo, insomnia, debilitating headaches, cognitive issues. And all of them say they heard a sound.
They could sometimes hear the sound that sounded like metal grating, sort of metal being dragged across the ground.
When they move away, it stops. And if they go back to where it's happening...
It started again. They could kind of walk in and out of what they described as a beam of energy hitting them. And so they clearly felt that this was something targeted, that something was being done to them.